The sky over Damascus that evening bled into a dusky orange, the kind of color that makes you feel like something is coming, though you can't name what. My boots were tired, my legs hollowed by miles, but I'd found myself walking slower than usual, as if every step along that quiet Virginia trail was pulling me deeper into a place where time had thickened. They call it Trail Town, USA, Damascus. I was 27, running from nothing in particular, but desperate for something unnamed, carrying only my battered pack, a journal, and a restless ache in my chest. By then, I had already spent weeks moving through forests, sleeping in thin nylon, letting the woods strip me down until there was nothing left but the rhythm of my feet and the pulse of the land. But on that evening, 5:44 p.m., I remember the time exactly. Something shifted. It began the way these things often do. Subtle, quiet, almost dismissible. But when the strange thing finally walked up to me, I could no longer pretend that the world was made of only the things I had words for. The sound came first, soft and deliberate. The tread of someone else's boots was keeping time with mine, though I was certain the trail behind me had been empty for at least an hour. I stopped. The sound stopped. I breathed, tried to laugh it off, told myself I was frayed and hearing echoes against the ridgeline. But when I started again, so did the footsteps, steady, close, perfectly in rhythm. I turned quickly, heart rising into my throat, and that's when I saw her. A woman, her frame wiry and strong, gray streaking her hair though her face looked younger, as though weather and time had both preserved and worn her in equal measure. She raised her hand in a small wave, the kind that said she didn't mean to frighten me. She introduced herself simply as June. Her voice was calm, carried the rasp of wood smoke and long silence. She said she was what hikers call a trail angel, someone who offers help, kindness, even food or shelter to travelers moving through. And in that instant, some buried part of me let its guard down. We all want to believe in angels, even when they come on two tired feet. But what unsettled me wasn't her presence, it was her familiarity. She looked like someone I had seen before, though I couldn't place her. Not on the trail, not in town, not in my old life. The way her eyes lingered too long when they met mine felt as though she knew more about me than she should. She walked beside me, carrying nothing, no pack, no canteen, not even a stick. Just herself, moving lightly, as though the woods had learned to cradle her steps. We reached a clearing where the maples thinned into a field cut by golden light, and she told me stories about storms that swept tents into rivers, about hikers who had lost their way and never returned, about how the forest keeps more than it gives back. I asked where she lived. She smiled and said, "Nowhere in particular. Always close." And there was something in that answer that burrowed under my skin, a splinter of unease. We walked together for nearly an hour, though it felt both longer and shorter, the way time bends when you're no longer sure who you're with. June kept glancing at the trees as if she were listening for something beyond my hearing. At one point, she reached out, touched my shoulder, and said, "If the woods call your name after dark, don't answer." She said it casually, but her grip was firm, grounding, as though she had seen it happen before. I laughed uneasily, asked her if that was some kind of local superstition. She didn't laugh. She just nodded, and her eyes softened, filled with something I can only describe as mourning. That look hollowed me out more than the warning itself. When we reached the edge of Damascus, she stopped walking. Just stopped, as though the invisible tether holding her to the trail had reached its end. I turned to thank her, but she was already looking away, back toward the mountains, as though she belonged more to them than to the town below. I stepped into the street, blinked against the sudden sight of houses and bicycles and porch swings, turned to wave goodbye. She was gone. No rustle of branches, no sound of retreating steps, just gone. It would have ended there, a strange encounter tucked into the folds of memory, if not for the diner. Hungry and restless, I went in for coffee and pie, sat at the counter, still thinking of June. A man on the next stool, a local with a heavy drawl, asked if I was hiking through. We traded a few words, and when I mentioned I'd just been walking with a woman named June, who called herself a trail angel, his face paled. He put down his fork and stared at me like I'd said something obscene. Slowly, carefully, he asked what she looked like. I told him. He leaned back, shook his head. His voice dropped to a whisper. You couldn't have. June Hale's been missing 20 years. The diner noise fell away in my ears, as if someone had lowered the volume of the world. I felt cold, the kind of cold that isn't weather, but realization. I wanted to argue, wanted to laugh it off, but the man's expression held me. He told me June had been a beloved local, a woman who hiked every day, who vanished without a trace in the late summer of 2005. They'd searched, scoured the ridges, drained parts of the river, nothing, just gone. And yet I had spoken with her, walked beside her, felt her hands steady on my shoulder. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my tent just outside of town, staring at the fabric ceiling, listening for footsteps that didn't belong. The woods outside breathed slow and heavy, as though holding something back. And in that silence, my thoughts spiraled. Had I imagined her? Had exhaustion conjured her? Or had the trail itself delivered her to me, as if some places are so saturated with memory they can't help but replay themselves? By dawn, one truth remained clear. Whether spirit or woman, June had looked into my eyes with recognition, not of a stranger, of someone she had been waiting for. And that's what gnawed at me as the days stretched on, the feeling that she hadn't appeared by accident, that she had known me before I even set foot in Damascus. I left Damascus at sunrise, the town quiet behind me, smoke from a single chimney rising like a question into the pale sky. The trail stretched ahead, damp with dew, and each step carried the weight of that encounter. I wanted to believe it was exhaustion, that my mind had stitched a story together from shadows and loneliness. But the truth pressed harder with every mile. I hadn't imagined her touch on my shoulder, the rhythm of her footsteps matching mine, the cadence of her voice warning me not to answer the woods after dark. That was real. Too real. And though my body carried me forward, part of me stayed there at the edge of town, waiting for her to appear again from between the trees. The Appalachian Trail has a way of stripping you open. By the time I hitched up my pack straps, I was already raw from days of silence, of measuring my worth in miles and blisters. I was hiking not just for the views or the challenge, but because I needed distance from people, from noise, from the parts of myself I didn't know how to live with anymore. But walking alone also sharpens the edges of fear. The forest grows heavier when there's no one to laugh off the strange sounds, no one to confirm that you're not just hearing things. You start noticing how the air changes at twilight, how some patches of woods feel charged, alive, as though they've been watching hikers for centuries. That evening, as the sun bled out behind the ridges, I found myself camping just shy of White Top Mountain. The air smelled of wet pine needles, and a storm whispered somewhere distant, rolling low across the Blue Ridge. I'd pitched my tent on a patch of flat ground near a cluster of rhododendrons. Dinner was nothing more than instant rice and jerky, but in the quiet, every taste carried weight. When darkness finally settled, it brought with it an unease I hadn't felt since the first week on the trail. I lay inside the tent, listening to the rhythm of the woods, crickets, wind shifting through leaves, the occasional snap of a branch, but woven through all of it was something else, faint, like the impression of footsteps moving where there should be none. I told myself to breathe, to ground myself in the ordinary, the rustle of fabric against my skin, the sound of my heart against my ear, the smell of damp earth beneath me. But then, just as sleep began to pull me under, I heard it, a whisper. Not words at first, just a sound shaped like one. Then, clearer, unmistakable, my name. It came from outside the tent, soft, patient, almost coaxing. I froze, my body stiffening into the ground, lungs refusing air. The voice wasn't sharp or malicious. It was calm, familiar, too familiar. It sounded like June. Her warning slammed into me. If the woods call your name after dark, don't answer. Every instinct screamed at me to unzip the tent, to shine my headlamp, to see who or what stood beyond the thin nylon. but something deeper held me still, a gravity older than fear. I pressed my lips together and refused to speak, refused to acknowledge. The voice came again, closer this time, almost tender. "I just want to talk," it said. My throat ached with the effort of silence. I curled tighter into myself, pulling the sleeping bag over my head like a child hiding from monsters, and waited. Minutes stretched into an hour. At some point, the voice stopped. The forest exhaled. My body finally loosened, though sleep never came. When the dawn broke, pale and unconvincing, I unzipped the tent with trembling hands. The ground outside was damp, covered in needles and leaves. And there, no more than a foot from where my head had lain, were footprints. Bare footprints, small, narrow, pressed into the earth as though someone had stood watching me for hours. The trail teaches you things about fear you don't learn in cities. Fear isn't always loud. It isn't always violence or threat. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, waiting for you to let your guard down. As I packed up my gear, my hands shook not from fatigue, but from the knowledge that I had been close, terrifyingly close, to answering something I shouldn't. And the cruelest part, I didn't know if that something was danger or salvation. By the time I reached the ridgeline, clouds had gathered thick and heavy, swallowing the sun. The wind cut harder, carrying with it the smell of rain and something metallic like iron. I passed a pair of hikers headed southbound. We exchanged the usual nods, brief words about the weather. I wanted to ask them if they'd seen a woman named June, if they'd heard a voice in the night. But the words lodged in my throat. What if they laughed? Worse. What if they said yes? At a shelter near Lost Mountain, I stopped to rest. A few other thru hikers were there, tired and dirty, but smiling with that trail-worn resilience. We traded stories, jokes, and shared food. For a while, I let myself believe in normalcy again. But then one of the hikers, an older man with a sunburnt face, leaned forward when I mentioned Damascus. His expression shifted, serious. He asked if anyone had offered me help along the trail. An older woman, maybe. My stomach dropped. I asked him why. He rubbed his jaw, looked around at the others, then said, "People still see her. Been missing for years, but folks swear she shows up now and then. Always around Damascus. Always helpful, kind. They call her a trail angel, but..." He trailed off, his gaze darkening. "Some say she's trying to lead people somewhere they don't come back from." The firelight flickered across our faces, and suddenly the laughter, the warmth of shared food, felt fragile. That night, lying in the shelter, I couldn't stop replaying his words. Somewhere they don't come back from. Rain hammered the shelter roof that night, each drop a reminder that I wasn't alone, even when no one spoke. The other hikers had drifted into uneasy sleep, their breaths rising and falling in rhythm, but my eyes stayed wide open, fixed on the dark gap of the doorway. The forest outside was black and restless, the storm shifting through its bones. I told myself I was safe, that a wooden shelter and the thin bodies of strangers were enough to keep the unknown at bay. But every time the thunder cracked, I swore I could see her silhouette outlined in the flashes of white. June, standing still in the downpour, her hair plastered to her face, waiting. By morning, the rain had softened, though the woods looked raw and dripping, the trail itself a ribbon of mud. I hiked on, slower than usual, exhaustion dragging at my shoulders. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was aware of me now, that every step I took was being measured. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder more than forward, waiting to see her step out of the mist like she had before. Sometimes I swore I saw her shadow between the trees, pacing me, keeping the same distance no matter how fast or slow I went. Midday, I came across a small trailhead where locals often left supplies for thru hikers, coolers of soda, boxes of snacks, even folded notes with encouragement. Trail magic, they called it. But on that day, the cooler was empty, the boxes overturned as though someone had rifled through and taken only what they needed. A slip of paper was weighted under a stone. I bent to pick it up, expecting some generic quote. Instead, in faint handwriting that looked faded with time, it read, "Don't answer after dark, Jay." My knees nearly buckled. I looked around, heart pounding against my ribs. No one. Just the whisper of the wind and the dripping leaves. My first instinct was to tear the note up aside, to refuse its existence. But I folded it carefully, slipped it into my journal, and kept walking. Some part of me understood I was being marked, chosen, or maybe warned. And the cruelest truth was I didn't know if I wanted to resist or follow. That evening, I set up camp by a creek, its water rushing fast and cold, promising safety in its noise. The woods were thick with ferns, and the ground smelled of wet earth. I built a fire with trembling hands, though the wood hissed with leftover rain. I needed the light, needed its circle of warmth against the growing dark. As the night deepened, I pulled out the note again, tracing the letters. J. It was her. It had to be. The woman I'd met had written those words, maybe not yesterday, maybe not even in this decade, but the message had reached me. That's when I realized the emotional knot I was trapped in. Fear was one thing, yes, but what held me tighter was recognition. She hadn't warned me like a stranger. She had warned me like someone who knew I would be the one to need it. That implied connection, history, a thread between us I couldn't see but could feel tugging tighter every step I took. The creek masked other sounds, but around midnight I heard it again. My name, stretched long and soft as though it were being carried on water. This time I didn't hide in my bag. I sat up, the fire reduced to a smear of glowing coals, the shadows reaching long and uncertain. My name came again, not angry, not even pleading, simply insistent, as though the woods themselves wanted to test me. And just beyond the firelight, on the far bank of the creek, I saw her. June. Her outline was clear in the starlight, her hair loose, her clothes unchanged. She lifted her hand, the same gentle wave as before, and then pointed upstream. Slowly, deliberately. I don't remember standing. I don't remember crossing the creek, though my boots were soaked when I came to. I just remember following. The woods narrowed into a corridor of trees, their trunks black and slick with rain. My breath came in ragged bursts, every nerve screaming to turn back. But I kept going, compelled not by trust, but by something deeper. Something like recognition, something that whispered this path wasn't new to me. At last, the forest opened into a clearing. The grass was tall, the earth uneven. And there, half buried in moss, was a stone marker. My flashlight beam quivered across it, revealing letters carved by hand, weather-worn but legible. June Hale, 1962-2005. Beloved daughter, lost but not forgotten. The world tilted. My stomach clenched as if the ground itself had betrayed me. I turned to find her, to demand answers, but the clearing was empty. Only the wind answered, moving through the grass like a whisper. I dropped to my knees before the stone, my hands trembling as I touched the cold surface. She had led me here, not to hurt me, but to show me what no search party had found. And in that moment, fear gave way to something stranger. Grief. Grief for a woman I had never known, yet who had walked beside me, warned me, and carried me into her story. My eyes blurred with tears I hadn't expected, my chest heaving with the weight of connection. Because if she was gone, truly gone, then why did she choose me? Why did her voice sound so familiar, as though I'd heard it before I ever set foot on the trail? I didn't sleep that night. I sat in that clearing until dawn, my body soaked with dew, the stone marker like an anchor in the shifting fog. And when the first light cut through the trees, I swore I felt a hand on my shoulder again, steady, grounding, gentle. Just for a moment, then gone. I carried that weight with me for the rest of the trail. Not just fears, but the unbearable gift of being chosen to witness what others could not. By the time I reached Mount Rogers, the highest point in Virginia, the air felt different. Thinner, sharper, like every breath carried not just oxygen, but memory. The trail wound through spruce and fir, the trees crowding close until the world smelled of resin and old rain. I should have been focused on the climb, on the ache in my calves and the burn in my lungs. Instead, all I could think about was the marker, the cold weight of June Hale's name etched in stone, and the unbearable knowledge that she hadn't been gone from the trail at all. It became impossible not to notice the patterns. A flash of gray hair slipping behind a tree, a handprint on a wet rock that hadn't been there moments before. Notes that appeared in shelters, short warnings signed only with that same J. Some were fresh, ink still sharp. Others looked decades old, paper yellowed, the handwriting trembling as though written in another time. And yet all of them were meant for me. Hikers laughed it off, said trail angels had a way of leaving magic in strange places, but I knew better. This wasn't magic. This was a haunting with purpose. And the question that consumed me wasn't why June anymore. It was why me. I thought back to the way she had looked at me that first evening, the pause in her smile, the softness in her eyes that hadn't belonged to a stranger. Recognition. She knew me. But how? I'd never been to Damascus before. I had no family there, at least none that I knew of. Yet the thread between us tightened with every mile, pulling me deeper into her story, whether I wanted it or not. One night, weeks later, I camped near a bald ridge where wild ponies grazed in the twilight. Their shapes moved like shadows against the horizon, manes whipping in the wind. It should have been beautiful, peaceful, but the weight of dread pressed harder than the beauty could soften. As the stars came alive overhead, I opened my journal, flipping back through the pages of notes and sketches I'd carried since Springer Mountain. Between my scrawled entries, I found something I hadn't written. The handwriting wasn't mine. It was hers. The ink faint, as though pressed onto the page years ago, waiting for me to find it. The words were simple. You've been here before. The fire in my chest nearly choked me. I slammed the book shut, my hands trembling, and glanced around the ridge. The ponies shifted, their hooves thudding softly in the grass. Beyond them, the dark trees loomed like sentinels. I whispered out loud, my voice unsteady. What do you want from me? For a long time, there was only the wind. Then, faintly, carried as if from the far side of the ridge, came her reply. To remember. Sleep never came. My mind spun with questions I didn't have the courage to ask myself. What could I remember that wasn't mine? What connection tied me to a woman who had vanished before I ever set foot on the trail? When I reached a small trail town days later, I sought answers the way desperate people do, with shaky questions asked in hushed tones. At a general store, I asked the old clerk if he'd heard of June Hale. His eyes narrowed, and he leaned across the counter, lowering his voice. Everyone around here knew June, he said. She was kind, always helping hikers, but she had a way about her, like she could see straight through you. He hesitated, then added, her family left town after she disappeared, except her brother, stayed on the ridge. Folks don't talk about him much. That night, I couldn't stop picturing her face, the resemblance it carried to people I thought I didn't know. And for the first time, I wondered if the recognition in her eyes hadn't been her mistake, but mine. The next stretch of trail passed in a blur of dread and revelation. Memories that weren't mine began surfacing in dreams, visions of Damascus streets I shouldn't have known, of a farmhouse with chipped white paint, of a girl with the same gray-streaked hair laughing on a summer porch. I woke drenched in sweat, heart racing, each dream gnawing deeper into my certainty of who I was. By the time I circled back toward Damascus weeks later, my journal was filled with more questions than entries. I needed answers, even if they shattered me. The town looked the same as before, quiet, timeless, as if no years had passed at all. I walked its streets like a ghost returning home, though I had never called it mine. At the library, I found it, the old newspaper clippings from 2005. June Hale, beloved daughter, vanished on the trail. Search parties, vigils, endless speculation. And then, tucked into the bottom of one page, a detail that froze me where I stood. She was last seen at 5:44 p.m. walking with a young man whose description matched no one from the area. His identity was never confirmed. The words punched the breath from my lungs. The paper was dated 20 years before, and yet the description matched me. My height, my hair, my age. A ghost story looping back on itself. The library lights flickered as the weight of it pressed down. I hadn't just met June Hale, I had been part of her vanishing. I staggered out of that library like a drunk, the words from that yellowed newspaper clipping still gnawing inside me. A young man seen with her at 5:44 p.m., the exact time I'd first met June on the trail, down to the minute. I replayed every detail. Her gray-streaked hair, the way she'd matched my footsteps, the way she had said my name in the night. It wasn't just that she'd known me, it was that she'd remembered me. And if the paper was right, if some unknown man had been walking with her the day she vanished, then it meant I had been there all along. Not today, not yesterday, but 20 years ago. The thought clawed at me. I tried to fight it off with reason, with logic. I told myself I wasn't even alive then, or was I? The dates tangled in my head, the years slipping. The more I tried to anchor myself in certainty, the less solid the ground beneath me felt. My age, my timeline, my identity, suddenly none of it was steady. I began to wonder if the trail itself bent more than just bodies. Maybe it bent time. Maybe it had been waiting for me to walk into the story that I had already lived once. The sun was setting by the time I left town, heading back toward the forest as though I had no choice. The sky above Damascus bled purple and red, and the shadows between the trees stretched long and hungry. I should have been terrified, but instead there was a strange calm in me, as if my body already knew the path. My boots carried me without hesitation, deeper into the woods, the air thickening with silence. Every tree, every bend felt familiar, not from maps or memory, but from something older, something lived twice. And then I heard it again. Footsteps. The same rhythm as mine, the same pause when I stopped. I didn't turn around this time. I just kept walking until the clearing opened ahead, the same one where we'd first met. My chest tightened. The air seemed to hold its breath. And then she was there. June. Not aged, not ghostly, not altered by death. Just as I had seen her before, alive, steady, eyes soft with recognition. "You came back," she said. Her voice was calm, the same rasp of wood smoke, but underneath it I heard the ache of years spent waiting. My throat tightened. "What is this? Who am I to you?" She stepped closer, the light catching the lines of her face. "You walked me here before. You walked me to the place I never returned from." Her eyes shone, but not with anger, with sorrow. "And you forgot." The clearing tilted around me. I don't. My words broke, but pieces slid into place anyway. The dreams of the farmhouse, the recognition in her gaze, the way her hand on my shoulder had steadied me like she'd done it before. Somehow, impossibly, I had been part of her last day. Maybe another life. Maybe another version of myself. Maybe the trail had folded me back into that moment to face what I had left undone. "Why me?" I whispered. "Because you were the last," she said, "the last one to see me, the last one to hear my name." She stepped even closer, her face inches from mine, her eyes filled with a truth I wasn't ready to hold. "And now the trail won't let you go until you remember the rest." The forest around us fell utterly silent. No wind, no insects, no distant water. Just silence, heavy and final. And in that silence, I realized something chilling. I didn't know if I had led her to safety or to her death, but I was about to find out. She reached for my hand. Her touch was warm, not ghostly, not imagined, real. And as her fingers closed around mine, the woods bent again. The clearing dissolved, the air thickened, and the world snapped backward like a pulled thread. The light shifted, the smell of summer grass filled my lungs, and I stood not in the present, but in 2005. The trail looked younger, untouched, and so did I. I saw myself. Another version of me walking beside June, laughing, unaware of the weight of the moment. I saw the way she trusted me, the way I carried the map, the way I led her toward the ridge, toward the place her stone marker would later sit. My stomach clenched, nausea curling through me. This was the truth unraveling, and it was too late to look away. The air grew colder, the light dimmed. And just ahead, the ridge opened into shadow. June turned to me, the other me, and smiled. And for the first time, I saw what waited at the edge of the woods. Something darker than the trees, something that had been calling her name long before I ever knew her. And the worst part? That shadow was looking at me, not her. The ridge opened like a wound in the earth, its rocky lip hanging over a drop where the trees fell away into a dark basin. In the vision, or memory, or whatever twisted overlap of time this was, I saw the younger me standing there beside June, his shoulders relaxed, his pack slung carelessly, as if the weight of destiny hadn't yet settled on him, on me. But the air was wrong. It pulsed, heavy and charged, as though the forest itself was holding back a breath it didn't want to release. June glanced around, her smile faltering, her gaze sharpening toward the tree line. That was when I heard it again, the voice. The same low whisper that had called me outside the tent. It stretched her name like it loved her, like it owned her. June. She stiffened. The younger me laughed nervously, asked if she'd heard something. She said nothing, only gripped his arm. My chest tightened watching it, knowing what was coming. And then the shadow took form. Not a creature, not a human shape, but a density, darker than the night, bleeding between the trunks, folding the woods into itself. It was absence made visible. The younger me took a step back, his face pale, his lips trembling. But June, she didn't move. She was listening. The voice had her. I tried to shout, tried to warn myself. My throat worked, but no sound left me, as though the forest had sealed me silent. I stumbled forward, wanting to break the vision, to shake the younger me, to pull June away. But the ground sucked at my boots like mud, every step slower than thought. The shadow advanced. June swayed, as if entranced, her eyes locked on the dark, her breath shallow. And then I saw it, my own younger hand on her shoulder, steadying her, just as she had steadied me years later. Only now I realized that gesture wasn't reassurance, it was decision. Did I hold her back from the voice, or did I guide her into it? The memory blurred. 1 second I saw myself pulling her away. The next I saw my hand loosening, letting her step forward. 2 versions of the same moment, split and fighting. Remember, June's voice echoed, not the one in the memory, but the one behind me now, the older June who had walked with me in the present. I turned, and she was standing there, her face etched with both sorrow and strength. It was always you. You chose, and you forgot. The shadow seemed to stretch higher, the air pressing like weight on my chest. The younger me shouted her name, his voice ragged, but she didn't look at him. She looked at me, the me standing outside of time, watching it all unfold. Her eyes were pleading, demanding, knowing. That's when I understood the emotional knot I'd carried since Damascus. The dread wasn't just that I'd seen a ghost. The dread was that I had been the ghost all along. The trail had folded me back here to witness the moment I'd locked away, the moment I'd failed her, the moment I had left her to the woods. The shadow opened like a maw. June took 1 step forward, and the ridge swallowed her into silence. The younger me collapsed to his knees, his screams torn away by the wind. And I, both versions of me, felt the hollow slam into my chest, the unbearable weight of knowing I had let her vanish. The vision cracked apart, the ridge, the younger me, the shadow, all dissolving into fragments of night. I was back on the trail, knees in the dirt, gasping like I'd been drowning. June was gone, truly gone. But in the silence, a single voice pressed against my ear, hers, soft, steady, sorrowful. Now you remember. I shook, my chest breaking open with grief, rage, guilt, all the things I had buried. Tears ran hot down my face. I whispered into the woods, why me? Why show me now? The wind shifted through the branches, carrying her answer like a secret I wasn't meant to hold. Because you're still walking, and I'm not. And then the forest exhaled, the night filling again with its ordinary sounds, the chirp of crickets, the rush of wind through pine. But nothing would ever be ordinary again. I had seen what I had done, or failed to do. And I knew, as sure as I knew my own name, that the trail hadn't finished with me. For days after the vision, the trail turned into a mirror I couldn't look away from. Every step felt like I was retracing my own crime scene. The ridges and hollows weren't just geography anymore. They were witnesses. They had watched me lead June to the edge, watched me hesitate, watched me falter, and now they seemed to murmur her absence back to me with every gust of wind. I tried to keep moving, tried to fall back into the rhythm of hiking, but the forest wouldn't let me. At night, my firewood refused to catch until I whispered her name under my breath, as though the woods were bargaining. In the mornings, dew clung to my boots like it didn't want me to go forward. I'd passed shelters where hikers carved their names into beams, but when I traced the letters with my fingers, I always found hers, faint, scratched deep, June 2005. Sometimes the wood still felt warm, as if she had just carved it. It became clear This wasn't just about June's death. The trail was binding me to it, binding me to her. And the real horror wasn't that I had remembered, it was that now the memory demanded I choose again. The breaking point came near the Virginia Creeper Trail, where wooden bridges stretch across the river like spines. The sun was setting, the water beneath roaring dark and restless, and I felt her before I saw her, June. Standing in the middle of the bridge, her figure silhouetted against the fading light. My chest collapsed in on itself. My legs kept moving without my permission, carrying me closer until I could see her face. Calm, waiting, patient in that terrible way the dead can be. "You know now," she said softly. "You've seen what you did." I stopped short, gripping the railing, my knuckles white. "I didn't mean to," I choked. "I didn't know what was happening." Her eyes softened with something crueler than anger. "Forgiveness. That's why it happened. You didn't know, and you let me go." The river groaned beneath us. The boards creaked under her bare feet. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. She stepped closer, and the air turned sharp, electric, heavy with storm. "The trail doesn't let unfinished things rest. You carry me with you now. My choice became your burden, and your silence became my grave." She paused, tilting her head slightly, as though measuring the weight of my soul. "So tell me, will you keep walking like this never happened, or will you walk until you find the place where I can finally stop calling your name?" Her words landed like stones in my chest. I felt it then, the awful truth, that the trail hadn't just bent me back into her story, it had tied me to it. My journey was no longer mine. Every mile, marker, every summit, every town, she was there. Waiting, watching, asking. The storm broke overhead, lightning tearing across the sky, thunder slamming down into the valley. I blinked against the rain, and in that flash she was gone. The bridge stretched empty, just boards slick with water, but her voice lingered in my head, steady, unyielding. "You're still walking, and I'm not." I dropped to my knees on that bridge, the rain soaking me through, the river swallowing my sobs. The emotional dilemma was unbearable. Do I keep walking this trail, haunted, bound to a story I can't undo? Or do I turn back, admit defeat, and abandon the path she died on? Either choice felt like betrayal. And that's when I realized the trail itself was watching my answer. The forest, the bridges, the rivers, the ridges, they weren't just scenery, they were judges. And until I chose, none of this would let me go. So I stood shaking, heart pounding against my ribs, and I whispered into the storm, "I'll keep walking, for both of us." The thunder rolled, the rain hissed, and for a fleeting second, the forest felt less heavy, as though it had heard me. But even as I shouldered my pack, one thought twisted in my gut like a knife. If I was walking for both of us, then the trail might demand both of us before the end. The vow to walk for both of us felt noble in the moment, but as the days dragged on, it became a weight heavier than my pack. The trail seemed to hear it, to take it literally. Every mile was no longer mine, it belonged to her. When I ate, I thought of the meals she never got to finish. When I set up camp, I felt the empty space beside me where she should have been. When I laughed with other hikers, the sound curdled because hers was missing. But the forest was not done pressing. The first night after the storm, I dreamed of walking with her again. Not the older June who had appeared to me on the trail, but the younger version, the one from that summer of 2005. She laughed at something I said, tossed her hair back in the sun, and for a heartbeat, I forgot the ending. I wanted to stay in that dream forever. But then her laugh cut short, strangled into silence, and she turned her head toward the trees, toward that shadow. I woke with my throat raw from shouting her name, my body slick with sweat. The dream followed me into the day. I found myself scanning every tree line, every hollow, waiting for the shadow to step out. When the wind passed through the branches, I swore I heard it mutter her name. Worse, sometimes it muttered mine. By the time I reached Grayson Highlands, where wild ponies grazed among ancient boulders, I was unraveling. The beauty of it, the green hills rolling under a vast blue sky, the ponies brushing against my arms with gentle warmth, should have grounded me. But all I saw were ghosts. The pony's eyes reflected June's face. The stones looked like graves. Even the sky felt wrong, too wide, as if it was exposing me to something I wasn't meant to endure. That evening, when the sun burned down to embers across the horizon, I sat alone near the fire and pulled out my journal. Flipping past the familiar notes, I found more handwriting that wasn't mine. Not J this time. Just a line written sharp, insistent. You don't get to choose for both of us. The words struck like a knife. My vow, my desperate attempt to make meaning out of guilt, it wasn't what she wanted. Maybe it had never been. I slammed the book shut, my heart thundering, and whispered into the trees, "Then what do you want me to do?" The woods stirred. I felt her before I saw her, a shift in the air, a weight behind my shoulder. June stepped into the glow of the fire, her face streaked with something that wasn't rain. Sorrow, anger, recognition. "I wanted to live," she said quietly. Her voice was steady, but her eyes burned. "And you let me walk into the dark. You can't fix that by walking longer. You can't carry me like a pack on your back. You need to face what you did." The fire popped, sparks spitting upward like stars breaking loose. My mouth dried. "But I don't even know if I let you go or tried to save you," I whispered. The memory, it splits, it won't stay still. She crouched beside me, her face inches from mine. Her eyes were wet, gleaming, endless. "That's the curse of it," she said. "You'll never know which was true. The trail remembers both, and it will keep you here until you stop trying to rewrite it." Her words hollowed me. I understood then that the trail didn't want a vow or a penance or even a witness. It wanted acceptance. It wanted me to admit that I had failed, that I had been the last one to see her alive, and that nothing I did, no miles, no prayers, no desperate promises, would give her back her life. The fire flickered low. The woods grew louder again. Night birds, insects, the ordinary music of the earth. But all of it sounded like a single truth humming under the surface. This was my burden to carry, not hers. I looked up, and she was gone. Not dissolved, and not vanished, just absent, like a presence that had finally stepped away. The clearing felt emptier than it had in weeks, and for the first time I knew what that emptiness meant. The trail had released her, and it had left me behind. The tears came then, unrelenting, years' worth of grief and guilt finally cracking me open. I pressed my face into my hands, my body shaking, the fire dying low. The wind carried her name one last taft, not insistent, a farewell. When dawn broke, I rose with swollen eyes, packed my gear, and stepped back onto the path. The woods no longer whispered her name. They whispered mine, and I understood. I was still walking. She wasn't. But every mile I took from that morning on was different. Not carrying her, not fixing her story, just living mine, with the weight of hers forever written into it. And as the ridges unfolded before me, I finally understood the lesson Damascus had branded into my bones. The trail doesn't just strip you bare, it shows you the ghosts you're built from. Some you meet in strangers, some you find in yourself. And if you're not careful, you'll discover that sometimes you're both. I remember the silence before it began. The kind of silence that doesn't belong to nature, but to something else entirely. A silence so heavy it pressed down on the lungs, making even the smallest breath sound loud, intrusive, and wrong. My name is Daniel. I was 26 at the time, and I had chosen Mount Madison for my solo camping trip. It wasn't my first time in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, but it was the first time I set foot there with no one else, no climbing partner, no familiar voices, no easy way out. I had planned this trip with precision, maps memorized, gear checked twice, food packed for 3 nights. But there are some things that no amount of preparation can shield you from. Some things wait for you in the wilderness, watching patiently, and when the moment is right, they take everything you thought you knew about safety and turn it into ash. The day had been clear when I started my ascent. The late summer sky stretched wide and blue, the ridgelines cut sharp against the horizon. By the time I reached the tree line, the wind had begun to pick up, thin and cold, like needles pricking at my skin. I set up camp in a clearing not far from the Osgood Trail, where the slope leveled just enough for a tent. The ground was damp, but manageable. I remember telling myself it was perfect, that I was far enough from the trail to feel isolated, but close enough that I could retreat if anything went wrong. I wanted that balance between wild solitude and the faint comfort of knowing civilization wasn't impossibly far away. That illusion didn't last long. The first sign of something wrong came with the fog. It moved in quickly, far quicker than any fog I had ever seen before in the mountains. At first, it was nothing more than a low mist hugging the ground, curling between rocks and tree roots like smoke rising from hidden embers. Then, within minutes, it thickened, rising, swallowing the air around me until I could barely see 3 feet past my own hands. My headlamp cut into it, but the light only bounced back, trapped inside the suffocating wall of haze. I had camped in fog before. It was nothing new, but this was different. This fog carried weight. It carried silence. And then it carried color. It began as a faint blush, barely visible in the beam of my lamp, a faint hue of pink smeared across the white thickness. I thought maybe it was my eyes straining, maybe I was imagining it, a trick of exhaustion. But the blush deepened, spreading like spilled ink, saturating the mist until it glowed a deep, pulsing red. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, even turned off my lamp and turned it back on again. But the color remained. It wasn't the red of sunset or embers or rust. It was darker, denser. The only word that came to mind was blood. And then, as if the mountain itself were conspiring to seal me in, the air grew wet, damp with the metallic scent of iron. That was when the silence broke. At first it was subtle, tiny droplets pattering against the fabric of my tent. I thought it was rain, sudden and unwelcome, but when I touched the wetness on the nylon wall, it was thicker, more viscous than water. I pulled my hand back and held it close to my lamp. Even in the red glow, I could see it clearly. Dark, smeared, and unmistakably red. My brain rejected it instantly, told me it had to be mud, paint, some illusion created by the strange fog. But deep down, every instinct screamed the truth. Something was bleeding from the sky. I stumbled outside, my boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. The fog wrapped itself around me, dense and clinging, and the red tint grew stronger until it was the only color left in the world. My breath steamed in front of me, but it was hard to tell where it ended, and the fog began. I lifted my hand to my nose, and the metallic stench was overwhelming. The ground wasn't just wet, it was slick. My campsite, my tent, the trees, the rocks, they all glistened as if painted in a crimson sheen. I stood there frozen, my mind blank, body paralyzed, until I heard it. A sound just beyond the veil. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, pressing against the wet soil with a weight that suggested something heavy, something that wasn't in a hurry. I turned my lamp toward the sound, but the light only hit the fog, refracting back in muted halos. The steps stopped when I moved. Then, after a pause, they resumed. Closer. I tried to speak, to call out, maybe to ask if it was another hiker caught in the same nightmare, but my voice cracked in my throat, strangled by the thickness of the air. My heart slammed in my chest, every muscle coiled tight, waiting for something, anything to emerge from the blood-red haze. It never did. Instead, the fog itself seemed to shift, to move like a living thing. It pressed in tighter, a wall closing around me. The sound of the footsteps vanished, replaced by something worse, breathing. Low, ragged, uneven. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once, seeping through the mist like a predator's growl. My instincts told me to run, but where? In the fog, every direction was the same. I didn't know where the trail was, where safety might lie. If I ran, I'd be blind. If I stayed, I was trapped. The dilemma burned through me. Move and risk vanishing into the mountain, or stay and face whatever was breathing just beyond sight. I don't know how long I stood there, locked between those two choices. Time felt suspended, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. Then came the flood. It didn't start with rain or with mist condensing into droplets. It started from the ground. The soil beneath me began to seep, then gush, as though the mountain's veins had ruptured, bleeding out through the earth. My boots sank into the mud, and within seconds, a stream of red water rushed around my ankles, carrying with it leaves, sticks, and the faint outlines of things I dared not name. The flood rose fast, unnaturally fast, until it licked at my knees, pushing and pulling at me like hands trying to drag me under. That was the moment I chose to move. I forced myself to wade forward, my hands outstretched, reaching through the fog like a blind man searching for a wall. Every step was a battle against the current, against the invisible pull of the mountain. My tent was gone in seconds, swallowed by the rising tide, the outline of my campsite erased as if it had never existed. My chest ached with fear, my lungs burned with the metallic air, and still I pressed on, one step at a time until the fog shifted, and I saw it, a shape, tall, motionless, half submerged in the blood-red flood. I froze, water swirling at my waist now, clinging to me with unnatural suction. The shape stood impossibly still, its edges blurred by the fog, its features swallowed by shadow. I wanted to believe it was a tree, some trunk rising stubbornly against the current, but then it tilted its head, and I knew I wasn't alone. My breath caught, chest heaving as if the fog itself had wrapped invisible fingers around my throat. That tilt of the head, so small, so deliberate, was more terrifying than any scream, any roar, any sudden lunge could ever be. It was a sign of awareness. It meant the thing was looking at me, even if I couldn't see its eyes. I wanted to turn, to thrash against the current and flee in the opposite direction, but my body betrayed me. My legs locked, my arms hung stiff at my sides, and I stood there waist-deep in red floodwater, staring at the unmoving silhouette. The world had narrowed to that single shape, the sound of the rushing current, and the wet metallic rattle of my own breath. Then it moved, not toward me, not yet, but one slow step, then another, as though testing the water. The flood swirled higher around its legs, yet it never staggered. The thing carried weight, but it didn't fight the current. It flowed with it, as if the mountain had carved the flood for its passage alone. My instincts screamed at me to stay silent, but something inside me cracked. A sound slipped past my lips, half whisper, half plea. "Who's there?" No answer. Just the red haze, the flood pushing harder, and the figure tilting its head again, almost curious, like a predator deciding whether the creature before it was prey or not. The silence that followed was unbearable. Even the mountains seemed to hush, every rushing current suddenly muted, every shifting leaf held still. I thought I'd gone deaf until I heard it, the breathing again, closer, louder, but not from the figure, from behind me. I spun, nearly losing my footing in the rushing water. My lamp cut across the fog, revealing nothing but endless red mist. Still, the breathing surrounded me, so close I could feel its tremors in my chest, vibrating through my ribs. I whipped the beam back toward the figure, and it was gone. The space where it had stood only seconds ago was empty, the flood swirling undisturbed. My skin prickled, my stomach dropped, my mind raced to catch up, but every explanation faltered. Trees don't vanish, rocks don't move, and no living thing should have been able to disappear without a ripple in that blood-red water. The breathing grew ragged now, faster, frantic, like something circling, like something pacing just out of reach. I staggered forward, half running, half wading through the rising flood, arms cutting into the mist like a swimmer desperate for air. My boots dragged against the soft ground, every step threatening to pull me under. But I couldn't stop. To stop meant surrender. To stop meant letting the unseen shapes close in. I could feel the fog thickening, the red bleeding deeper, until even the beam of my lamp seemed swallowed whole. And still the breathing followed, never closer, never farther, always at the edge of hearing. I don't know how long I ran, minutes, hours, time dissolved in the crimson blur. My lungs burned, my body ached, and when I finally collapsed against something solid, I realized I'd stumbled into a rock face, slick and wet, cold against my palms. Relief surged for a moment. A landmark, a chance to ground myself. I pressed close back to the stone, chest heaving, water rising to my waist now. The fog curled against the rock, swirling like smoke, and for the first time since it began, the mountain gave me something different. A sound. Not breathing, not footsteps, a voice. Low, guttural, broken like wind tearing through a hollow tree trunk. It didn't speak words, not words I understood, but the rhythm was unmistakable. A cadence, a chant. The sound burrowed into my skull, vibrating behind my eyes, filling me with a pressure that bordered on pain. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't stop. The sound wasn't entering from outside. It was blooming inside me, a resonance in my bones. My body shook, knees buckling under the weight of it, and for a moment I thought the flood would drag me under. But then it stopped. The chant, the breathing, even the rush of the flood, gone, all at once, like someone had cut a wire. The silence that followed was worse than the sound, a silence so deep it felt like the world had been erased. I lifted my head, sweat mixing with the mist on my face, and that's when I saw them. Eyes. Not one pair, dozens, maybe hundreds. Floating in the red fog, faint but undeniable, glowing like embers in the dark. Some high, some low, some hovering inches from the water's surface, all staring at me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Every survival instinct in my body screamed to dive into the flood, to claw my way out, to do something. But there was nowhere to go. They had surrounded me, a ring of glowing eyes, unblinking, patient, waiting. And then they blinked, all at once. The fog pulsed with the movement like a heartbeat. The current surged stronger, nearly pulling me from the rock, and with it came a sound that didn't belong to this world. Not footsteps, not voices, something deeper, something older. The mountain itself groaning, splitting, exhaling centuries of silence into one awful sound. And in that instant, as the red flood clawed higher toward my chest, I realized the truth. This wasn't just weather or fog or some strange trick of light. The mountain was alive, and it was bleeding. The flood pressed higher, swirling against my chest now, dragging at my jacket like greedy fingers. Every muscle in me wanted to fight, to thrash, to push against the current. But another part of me, the part that knew when a storm was stronger than flesh, when a mountain was older than courage, told me stillness might be my only chance. The eyes had not vanished. They hovered there, patient, glowing faintly in the red mist like coals waiting to burn. Some blinked slowly, others remained fixed and unyielding, but all of them were trained on me. I pressed my back harder against the slick wall of stone, as though the mountain itself could protect me from what had seeped out of it. My breath came shallow and uneven, each inhale tasting of rust and ash. The silence returned, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was crowded. I could feel the presence of the eyes filling the air, pressing against my skin, crowding into my lungs. I tried to tell myself they weren't real, that my fear had conjured them, that exhaustion had twisted the fog into monsters. But lies don't hold in a place like that. The wilderness doesn't let you hide from the truth. Something shifted in the water. Not the current this time, but movement. Something beneath the surface, sliding against my legs. Smooth at first like a snake brushing by, then rougher, scraping against my boots. I froze, toes curling in my shoes, praying that whatever was under there would keep moving, that it wouldn't decide to rise. But it did. Slowly the water bulged, rippling outward as something thick pressed up from below. My stomach lurched. I braced against the rock, eyes darting back to the glowing embers in the fog. They didn't flinch, they didn't waver, they just watched. The bulge swelled until it broke the surface. A shape breached the crimson water, long, pale, slick with the same red sheen that coated everything else. At first I thought it was a branch, a log caught in the current. But then it bent, a joint. Then another. An arm, a human arm rising from the flood, fingers limp, nails split and broken. The sight froze the blood in my veins. The hand hung in the air for a heartbeat, then dropped back into the water, vanishing with barely a ripple. I should have screamed, should have turned and clawed my way up the rock face behind me, but my voice was gone, and my body was useless, paralyzed in the grip of that nightmare. Then another arm surfaced, this one closer, the pale flesh torn, wrist bent at an impossible angle. It reached higher, straining as though something beneath the water was pushing it up, offering it to the fog above. My heart hammered so hard I thought it would split my ribs, and then the chanting returned. Soft at first, so low I thought it was my pulse, but it grew, rising from the water itself, humming in the stone at my back. The cadence was the same as before, broken, guttural, relentless. But this time I understood something terrible. The voices weren't chanting above me. They were chanting beneath me, in the water, in the flood, in the mountain's bleeding veins. The arms multiplied. One by one they rose from the current, some grasping, some limp, some broken, some whole. They surfaced around me, each one pale and glistening, dripping red into red, a forest of limbs clawing for air. The eyes in the fog did not move. They only watched as though waiting to see what I would do. My mind split in two, one part screaming to flee, the other whispering that movement would draw them closer. But the flood made the choice for me. The current surged, stronger now, lifting me from my footing. My boots slid off the soft ground and I was swept into the swirl of arms. Cold fingers brushed my legs, clawed at my jacket, tangled in the straps of my pack. Panic exploded inside me. I kicked, thrashed, tore at the water, desperate to free myself from those reaching hands. Every brush of skin against mine felt wrong, soft and heavy, lifeless, yet determined. I could feel nails raking against the fabric of my clothes, pulling, always pulling. My lamp slipped from my grasp and vanished into the flood. The world plunged into a deeper red, lit only by the faint glow of the fog and the scattered ring of eyes. Blind panic seized me, but somehow instinct cut through. I tore at my pack straps, ripping the weight from my back. The arms seized it instantly, dragging it under, vanishing with the rest of the flood. My gear was gone, food, tent, rope, all of it, but my body broke free for a moment, tumbling in the current like driftwood. I gasped, lungs filling with the metallic taste of the flood, and clawed toward the rock wall again. My fingers found a ledge, slick and narrow, but enough to cling to. I hauled myself up, chest scraping against the stone, legs thrashing against the water below. Arms still reached, grasping just beneath me, pale fingers curling inches from my boots. The chanting swelled louder, vibrating through the stone, rattling my teeth. I pressed my forehead to the cold rock, tears burning in my eyes, and for the first time since it began, I prayed, not to any god I had known before, just to the mountain itself, to whatever lived in its heart, to anything that might hear me in that drowning silence. The eyes blinked again, all at once, and the fog moved. It peeled back, just slightly, opening a narrow corridor through the red haze. A path. I didn't trust it, didn't believe in it, but I had no choice. If the mountain wanted me gone, this was the only way. With every ounce of strength left in me, I pulled myself higher, legs kicking free of the grasping arms, and stumbled toward that corridor. The current fought me. The fog pressed against me, the chanting burrowed into my skull, but the path held. Step by step, breath by breath, I moved forward. And then, silence. I stumbled through the last veil of red mist and collapsed onto damp earth. The flood was gone. The fog had thinned to nothing. The world had returned to the cold, empty night of Mount Madison. My chest heaved, lungs desperate for clean air, my hands clutching at the mud like it was salvation itself. Behind me, where the fog had stood, there was nothing but darkness, no water, no arms, no eyes, only the mountain, silent and still. But the smell remained, that metallic stench of iron, and I knew the mountain wasn't done with me, not yet. The silence gnawed at me like teeth. It wasn't relief, it was the pause between heartbeats, the hush before the next strike. My body trembled from exhaustion, soaked through, fingers stiff from clawing at stone, but I forced myself onto my knees. The air was clearer here, though still tinged with that bitter metallic scent. My lamp was gone, swallowed by the flood, and the world lay dark, illuminated only by a dim smear of moonlight breaking through the thinning clouds above. For the first time, I thought I might live. But survival, I was about to learn, isn't the same as escape. The ground beneath me squelched with every shift of my weight. The soil was too soft, too saturated, as though it had absorbed not rainwater, but the same red tide that had almost dragged me under. When I pressed my hand against it, the mud oozed darker, thicker, clinging to my skin in threads that glistened faintly. I pulled back quickly, wiping my hand against my jacket, but the smear wouldn't leave. It stained deep and permanent, as though the mountain had branded me. That was when I heard the first cry. It didn't belong to any bird or animal I had ever known. It was thin, reedy, distant, like a child's voice carried on the wind, calling through the trees. My chest tightened instantly. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, a fragment of fear lingering in the night, but it came again, louder, closer. That thin, brittle sound rising from the direction of the trail I had long since lost in the fog. My mind raced. No children would be up here, not at this hour, not in this wilderness. The rational part of me whispered the truth. This was a lure. The same mountain that had shown me arms clawing from a flood was now tempting me with something familiar, something that demanded I follow. But fear has a strange way of pulling you in two directions at once. My instincts screamed to stay put, to dig into the soil, to wait until dawn brought clarity. And yet something deeper, primal, and irrational urged me forward. The cry echoed again, now more insistent, weaving through the trees like smoke. My legs carried me before my mind could object. Step after step into the half-light, into the forest that seemed to close around me tighter with every breath. Branches clawed at my jacket. Roots rose like veins in the earth, trying to trip me, to slow me down. The cry guided me, always just ahead, always out of reach. I quickened my pace, stumbling through undergrowth, my breath ragged, my body begging for rest. But something inside me was hooked, pulled by that voice like a fish on a line. And then I saw it. Through a break in the trees, illuminated by the pale slice of moonlight, stood a figure. Small, frail, shoulders hunched, its back turned toward me. It was the size of a child, but no child should have been there. Its clothes clung in tatters, wet and heavy, and the skin I could see was too pale, too thin, as if stretched over bone. My steps slowed, my mind finally catching up with the horror of what I was seeing. I knew, even before it moved, that this was no lost hiker, no lost child. This was the mountain's offering. The figure tilted its head, slow, deliberate, just as the shape in the flood had done. My stomach dropped, my chest clenched. And in that moment, every nerve screamed to turn, to flee, to run until my legs gave out. But my body betrayed me again, rooted to the spot, staring. The figure began to walk, not toward me, but away, deeper into the trees. The cry rose again, thin and broken, spilling from its lips without turning its head. It was leading me somewhere, and against every shred of reason, I followed. The forest grew darker, thicker. The moonlight couldn't reach through the canopy, and the air grew colder with every step. My breath came in clouds, my hands trembling at my sides. The figure moved steadily, unhurried, its cry constant, pulling me deeper into the mountain's heart. I wanted to stop, to turn back. But my feet carried me forward, driven by something I couldn't name: fear, curiosity, compulsion, perhaps all three. At last, the trees opened into a clearing. My stomach twisted the moment I stepped inside. The ground was wet, glistening under the faint light, but it wasn't water that reflected. It was the same red sheen. The clearing was a basin, a shallow bowl in the earth, and in its center rose a circle of stones, jagged and black, slick with the crimson glow. The figure stopped before them, head still tilted, and for the first time, it turned. Its face was wrong. Skin pale, eyes hollow, mouth stretched wider than it should have been, the cry spilling endlessly, even as the lips never moved. A sound without source, without breath. Its gaze fixed on me, and though those hollow sockets were empty, I felt its stare burn into me like fire. My knees buckled, and I fell hard into the wet soil, the red stain soaking into my clothes. The stones hummed, low, vibrating, the same cadence as the chant that had filled the flood. My bones rattled, my teeth clenched, and the figure stepped aside, gesturing or perhaps commanding with its thin, twisted hand. Toward the stones, toward the heart of the clearing. I shook my head, whispered no, begged under my breath. But the mountain wasn't asking. The chant swelled louder, the air thickening with sound, the ground trembling beneath me. Something beneath those stones was alive, something waiting, and it wanted me to come closer. I pressed my palms into the soil, tried to rise, to flee, but the earth itself seemed to grip me, pulling me toward the circle. The figure's cry pierced the air, higher now, desperate, insistent. My chest heaved, my vision blurred, And as the stones loomed taller, black against the crimson glow, I understood this was not a place I had found by accident. This was where the mountain had led me all along, and the mountain wanted a witness. The stones rose taller as I drew closer, though I hadn't stood. My knees scraped against the mud, my palms dragged through the thick, crimson-soaked earth, and still the ground pulled me forward. The air grew heavier, every breath a burden, thick with iron, rot, and something older, something like wet stone that had never seen the sun. The circle loomed before me, jagged edges gleaming as if sharpened not by nature, but by intent. They weren't simply placed, they were arranged, a pattern, a mark carved into the mountain's skin. The childlike figure stood at the edge of the stones, still facing me, still crying in that endless, breathless wail. Its face was slack, its hollow eyes unblinking, one thin arm lifted, beckoning me inside. My body resisted, trembling, clawing at the soil to slow my crawl. But the earth beneath me had decided, and choice had left me long ago. When my fingers touched the first stone, the chant erupted. It didn't come from the figure, nor from the fog, nor even from the air. It came from beneath, from the marrow of the mountain itself. 1,000 voices layered into one, rising and falling with inhuman cadence. It was not meant for ears, not meant for minds like mine, but it poured into me all the same. My skull burned with the pressure of it. My ribs ached with every note. Blood pricked at my nose, dripped to the soil, mingling with the red sheen already soaking the ground. The stones glowed faintly, veins of crimson light pulsing through them as though alive. Inside the circle, the earth shuddered, wet soil shifting like something beneath was pressing upward. I wanted to scream, to thrash, to deny what I was seeing, but my body betrayed me again, pulling forward step by step until I was inside the ring. The air shifted instantly, colder, thicker, as though the circle sealed me off from the world I had known and delivered me to something else entirely. The ground heaved, the soil split, and from the crack rose not water, not stone, but flesh. Pale, wet, glistening, it swelled upward like a vein bursting through skin. At first I thought it was another arm, like the ones I had seen in the flood, but it was larger, vast, the size of tree trunks, fingers curling out of the earth, joints cracking like boulders grinding together. The hand rose slowly, deliberately, until it hovered above me, blotting out the faint moonlight. My breath stopped. My body shook with terror so deep it felt like my bones would splinter under its weight. The chanting roared, the stones pulsed brighter, and the ground split wider. More hands surged upward, some twisted, some broken, some whole, clawing at the air, at the soil, at each other. The clearing became a nest of limbs, writhing and reaching, a forest of flesh straining for freedom. The cry of the childlike figure twisted, higher, sharper, until it was no longer a child's voice, but something ancient, something triumphant. The largest hand lowered, toward me. Its fingers spread wide, dripping crimson earth, each nail jagged and blackened, each joint bending too far, too wrong. I pressed back against the stones, but they burned with heat, searing into my spine, holding me in place. I couldn't run, couldn't hide. The hand reached lower, closer, until the air pressed heavy against my chest, the weight of it suffocating before it even touched me. And then it stopped. The hand hovered inches from my body, motionless. The chanting slowed, deepened. The eyes of the childlike figure fixed on mine, empty sockets glowing faintly with the same crimson light that pulsed through the stones. I felt something then, not touch, not breath, but intrusion. Like a thought that wasn't mine forcing itself into my mind. Images flickered behind my eyes. Mountains cracking open, rivers running red, forests burning without flame. A world drowned not in water, but in blood. The mountain wasn't trying to kill me, it was trying to show me. The realization cut through my terror like a blade. This was not a flood, not fog, not hallucination. It was revelation, a warning, or perhaps a promise. The mountain wanted me to see what slept beneath it, what it could unleash, and I understood then why it had spared me when it could have taken me 100 times over. I was not prey, I was not sacrifice, I was witness. The hand trembled above me, then curled slowly into a fist, dragging its claws through the soil, gouging deep trenches in the earth. The chanting ceased in an instant, the silence so sudden it rang in my skull. The figure lowered its arm, its endless cry choking off into nothing. The eyes in its sockets dimmed, flickered, then went out. It collapsed where it stood, falling into the crimson earth like a puppet with its strings severed. The hands sank. One by one they withdrew, dragging themselves back into the soil. The ground shuddered, sealing over the cracks, swallowing the crimson glow until only darkness remained. The stones cooled, their pulsing veins dimming to black, and the circle was still again. I knelt there, shaking, breath ragged, hands soaked in mud and blood that no longer shimmered. The silence returned, not empty, not peaceful, but waiting, watching. The mountain had closed its mouth, but I knew it was not done. I stumbled backward, dragging myself from the circle, my body screaming with pain and exhaustion. The forest beyond was quiet, as though none of it had happened, as though the world outside the stones had remained untouched. But I carried it now. The vision, the stain, the knowledge that Mount Madison held something older and hungrier than any of us could understand. And as I staggered through the trees, the soil soft beneath my boots, I knew the mountain had given me more than survival. It had given me a burden, to live with what I had seen, to carry the weight of knowing that the earth itself could bleed, and that one night when the time came, it would bleed again. The forest gave nothing back to me as I stumbled through it. No birds, no rustling leaves, no whisper of wind, only the squelch of my boots in the soft soil and the ragged wheeze of my breath. My body ached with every step, but the greater weight was not in my bones. It was in my chest, in my mind, in the burden that now pressed against me as heavily as the fog once had. I had been shown something I could not unsee, something I was never meant to see. Dawn came slowly, though it did not feel like salvation. A gray light crept through the trees, painting the world in lifeless tones. I thought the red had left with the fog, that the night had swallowed its horrors whole. But even in the pale dawn, I could see the soil dark and wet, stains smeared across bark and stone. When I raised my hands, my skin bore the same mark. No matter how I wiped, no matter how I rubbed, the faint tint of crimson remained, as if the mountain had claimed me with its own blood. My legs carried me down the slope, half walking, half sliding, guided only by the pull of gravity. I lost the trail more than once, circling trees, stumbling into gullies, but always I pressed downward. I didn't stop to rest, didn't stop to eat. Hunger was a hollow thing compared to the vision that gnawed inside me. By mid-morning, the fog had burned off entirely. The sky above was blue again, as if mocking me with its serenity. I passed no other hikers, heard no voices, saw no sign of the world I had left behind. Only silence. And though the sun rose high, it did nothing to warm me. A chill had settled deep into my marrow, a cold that would not leave. When at last I reached the base, where the tree line gave way to parking lot gravel, I thought I might collapse from relief. But there was no relief. My car was there, untouched, waiting. The world below the mountain went on unchanged, roads dry, streams clear, people living as though the mountain was nothing more than rock and forest. They did not know. They could not know. I sat behind the wheel, hands trembling against the steering column, and realized the truth. What I carried back with me was not just a memory. It was a burden, a vision, a promise. The mountain had not tried to destroy me. It had wanted me to see, to know, to remember, and I do. Even now, years later, I remember every detail, the way the fog bled into red, the weight of the flood, the eyes watching from the mist, the forest of pale arms reaching from the current, the circle of stones pulsing with life, and above all, massive, grotesque, almost gentle as it hovered above me, pressing a vision into my skull that will never fade. I've tried to tell myself it was madness, exhaustion, a hallucination born from fear and isolation, but I know better. Because sometimes when the night is quiet and the wind still, I smell it again, that metallic tang of iron, faint but undeniable. And when I close my eyes, I still see the mountain bleeding. That night on Mount Madison was not chance. It was invitation, a glimpse of something older than time, something that slumbers beneath stone and soil, waiting for the moment it will rise again. I don't know why I was chosen. I don't know why I was spared, but I do know this. The wilderness hides more than we can ever understand. It is not just trees and rivers and trails. It is alive. It remembers. And sometimes when it chooses, it shows us what it truly is. So if you ever find yourself alone in the mountains, if the fog rolls in thick and heavy, if the silence presses against your lungs, remember me. Remember this story. Remember that the earth beneath your boots is not passive. It is not sleeping. It is listening. And if the fog turns red, do not follow the cries. Do not enter the circle. Because once you've seen what bleeds beneath the mountain, you will carry it with you forever. The valley was silent except for the rhythm of our own breath. Two hikers standing beneath the sweep of Appalachian stars when the first metallic clang broke across the dark like a warning bell from nowhere. My name is Daniel. I was 27 that year, and I thought I knew what it meant to be comfortable in the wild. I had grown up in Carolina foothills, walking trails before I was old enough to spell their names, feeling that the woods were not just landscape, but inheritance. That night at Max Patch, I would learn how quickly that inheritance could shift into something unrecognizable, something that looked back at me with no warmth. I wasn't alone. My best friend Aaron hiked beside me, his breath visible in the cooling air. He was the kind of person who carried his confidence like a torch, steady, unflickering, certain that the mountains bent for him. When he suggested a late-night hike, carrying only headlamps and the promise of moonlight on the bald ridge, I agreed without hesitation. We set camp earlier in the day, cooked ramen on the tiny burner, joked about coyotes and old stories from locals who swore the ridgelines sang at night. I remember the way the wind carried those stories, like the valley itself was trying to repeat them. The climb wasn't hard. Max Patch is generous that way. Grassy fields, open sky, ridgelines rolling out like a green tide. But by 11 o'clock, the trails were empty. No other campers, no stray lanterns bobbing in the distance. Just us, the crunch of our boots, and the kind of silence that felt thick enough to hold its own weight. It was then, halfway through the valley, that it came, the metallic clanging, sharp, irregular, echoing off the hillsides as if someone were hammering on an unseen gate. Aaron stopped first, swung his headlamp in a wide arc. "You hear that?" he asked. His voice was casual, but his eyes betrayed him. I nodded, pulse already quickening. Out here, noises didn't lie. They carried meaning, warnings, sometimes history. I grew up hearing my grandfather talk about coal trains echoing through hollows at night, their metal screams carrying miles past the tracks. But there were no tracks near Max Patch. Nothing that explained a clang so deliberate. The sound didn't repeat immediately. We stood waiting, ears straining, hearts filling the silence with their own hammering. Then it came again, two sharp bangs like steel meeting steel. My first thought wasn't fear, it was human. Someone out here with us working on metal in the dead of night. But why? On this ridge? In this dark? Aaron wanted to follow it. He always wanted to chase, to prove something to himself, to the woods, maybe even to me. Could be a camper, could be somebody setting up equipment, he muttered, already moving forward. I followed, not out of agreement, but out of loyalty. My grandfather once told me, "You don't leave someone to walk toward a sound alone." Out here, that rule could mean the difference between being remembered and being searched for. As we pressed deeper into the valley, the clangs grew softer, more distant, as if whatever made them knew we were listening. The air grew colder too, a sharpness that didn't match the season. I felt sweat drying on my skin, leaving me shivering even as we climbed. My headlamp beam caught branches, grass, the rough shapes of rocks, but nothing else. And still, clang, clang, somewhere just beyond reach. I tried to convince myself it was nothing supernatural, nothing unearthly, maybe an old fence in the wind, maybe chains knocking against a forgotten gate. But my gut knew better. Wind doesn't strike metal in rhythm. Wind doesn't pause just long enough for you to question yourself. Aaron whispered, "It's close." His whisper was unnecessary. The valley had gone so still that even breath felt loud. He pointed to a shadowed dip in the ridge ahead. a darker hollow where trees knotted closer together. The clang had come from there. We both knew it. That was the moment fear turned into dilemma. Every part of me wanted to pull him back to say, no further, we go back to camp, we leave this sound to the dark. But another part, quieter, heavier, knew that if we turned back, we would never stop wondering. Curiosity is dangerous in the woods. It takes the shape of courage and leads you deeper than you meant to go. We reached the hollow. Our beams cut across bark, thorns, patches of mud, and there it was, a thin wire fence, rusted, half-collapsed, sagging between posts like a relic from another era. No animals stirred near it, no animals sign of fresh prints. But hanging from the wire were fragments of metal, long, rusted tools bent into hooks and blades, clattering faintly when the breeze moved them. The clangs had been from this strange wind chime of iron and decay, placed here deliberately. I stepped closer, the smell of rust sharp in my nose. It wasn't natural. Someone had built this. Someone wanted it here. And the wind that rattled it now felt wrong, too cold, too intentional. Aaron touched one of the hanging pieces, and it rang out across the hollow like a church bell, deep and final. My stomach twisted. I whispered for him to stop. He laughed, nervous but unwilling to show it, the sound echoing too much like the clang itself. That's when we heard the footsteps. Not ours, not imagined. Heavy, deliberate, pacing just beyond the tree line. My heart clenched hard enough I thought I might black out. Aaron froze, his hand still on the rusted hook. The clang died away, and in its place came the slow crunch of weight on leaves. One step, another, stopping. I didn't want to look. Every instinct told me to keep the light away from the trees. But Aaron, stubborn as always, raised his headlamp toward the sound. The beam flickered across trunks, branches, mist gathering low near the ground. Nothing, just the echo of silence waiting for us to move. Then the clang rang out again, louder, closer, as though struck by something unseen. That was when I realized the wind wasn't blowing. The night air was perfectly still. Whatever had made that sound had done it with intention. I grabbed Aaron's sleeve. My voice came out hoarse. We need to go. Now. But leaving wasn't so simple. The footsteps had begun again, circling, slow and steady, the way a predator might measure the distance to its prey. The clang repeated in answer, metal against metal, surrounding us in echoes that didn't match their source. It was no longer just about fear, it was about survival. And in that moment, under the cold stillness of Max Patch at 11:02 p.m., I learned that curiosity has a price, and sometimes the woods collect it in ways you can never repay. The steps in the leaves were not hurried, not careless. They were measured, deliberate, as if whoever or whatever circled us wanted us to hear. My headlamp beam wavered in my shaking hands, bouncing off the crooked fence and the dangling iron pieces. Each one seemed to glisten in the light, though rust doesn't shine. I tried to breathe quietly, but every inhale felt loud, each exhale betraying where I stood. Aaron whispered, "It's a person. Has to be." He said it like he was trying to convince himself. His grip tightened on the hook he'd touched, holding it as if the rusted shard of metal could become a weapon. His confidence had dimmed. I saw it in the way his shoulders curved forward, in how his voice caught before finishing the sentence. The footsteps stopped again. The silence pressed down, then clang. But this time it wasn't from the wire fence in front of us. It came from behind. I spun, heart racing, beam slicing across empty grass and shadows. Nothing there, no fence, no metal, nothing but the open slope of the ridge and the night beyond. Yet the sound had been undeniable, as if steel had struck steel just over my shoulder. Aaron cursed under his breath. There's more than one. My mouth went dry. I couldn't speak the thought forming in my head, the one that told me it wasn't multiple people. It was the same sound moving, leaping across space, echoing where it wanted. The ground itself felt restless under my boots, like standing on something alive, waiting for the right moment to remind you that you were trespassing. "Let's move," I whispered. I tried to make my voice steady, but it cracked anyway. I turned toward the trail that had led us here, intending to retrace, to retreat, but the path looked different in the dark. My headlamp showed bends in the grass that I didn't remember, shadows of trees that hadn't been there before. Aaron noticed too. His whisper was sharp, panicked now. "This isn't the way we came." The clang answered him, this time 3 strikes in quick succession, ringing so loud the wire fence quivered like it had felt the blow. My chest constricted. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was command, a warning, or maybe an invitation. I grabbed Aaron's arm and pulled him toward the ridge's incline. "Up," I hissed. Higher ground. That was the logic. From the top of Max Patch Bald, we could see everything, orient ourselves by the stars, maybe even catch sight of our camp's glow. The slope was steep, but adrenaline made our legs strong. Grass slapped at our knees, mud sucked at our boots, but we climbed anyway. The footsteps followed, not behind us now, but beside us, then crossing ahead, as if the sound circled through the earth itself. Each step was heavy, dragging, but relentless. I tried to quicken my pace, lungs burning, but no matter how fast we moved, the steps stayed close, taunting. When we reached the crest, I expected relief, some sense of distance from whatever stalked us. Instead, the view turned my stomach to ice. The bald ridge should have stretched wide and open, a rolling green crown under the stars. But in every direction, no matter where I looked, small clusters of iron dangled from stakes, swaying gently as if in wind I couldn't feel. They dotted the ridge like graves. Each one gleamed faintly under our beams, and though no 2 were the same, they all carried the same aura of wrongness. Tools turned into charms, hooks twisted into symbols, fragments of something broken turned into warnings. And then, all at once, they sang. Clang after clang, as if 100 unseen hands struck them in unison, ringing across the bald ridge with deafening force. My head pounded with it, chest rattling in rhythm until I couldn't tell if the sound came from outside or inside me. Aaron dropped to his knees, hands clamped over his ears, screaming something I couldn't hear. I staggered, light bouncing wildly, stars overhead blurring as if the sky itself trembled. The noise stopped. Silence dropped like a guillotine. Aaron's breathing was ragged, and mine wasn't better. For a moment I thought it was over, that we had endured whatever this was. But then I noticed something that froze my blood more than the clanging ever could. The fence line below us, the one with the dangling tools, was gone, vanished. Where we had stood only minutes before was nothing but grass and shadow, no sign that it had ever existed. My heart pounded so hard I swore the sound would give us away. Aaron staggered to his feet. His face was pale, sweat pouring despite the chill. He muttered, "We're not supposed to be here. We weren't meant to see this." His voice was hollow, stripped of its usual bravado. I wanted to agree, to tell him we should turn and run, but where would we run? The ridge stretched endlessly, iron fragments dotting the dark like stars fallen to earth. My compass was useless. I checked it, the needle spinning without settling. The stars overhead seemed to shift, constellations bending like they were being redrawn. That was when we heard it. The voice. Not footsteps, not clanging, but a voice. Low, metallic, resonant, like steel being dragged across stone, yet forming words beneath the distortion. It came from everywhere at once, echoing through the valley and inside my skull. "Stay." My chest seized. Aaron stumbled back, shaking his head violently. "No, no," he muttered over and over like a mantra. But the voice didn't stop. It repeated louder this time, forcing itself into every space inside me. "Stay." And with each repetition, the clanging followed. One strike, then another, echoing the syllables. I grabbed Aaron's arm and pulled, though I didn't know where to go. He resisted at first, rooted in place, as if the command had sunk claws into his bones. I shouted his name. The sound ripped raw from my throat. For a second, his eyes cleared, and he stumbled forward with me. We ran blindly, tripping, sliding, tearing through the tall grass. Behind us, the valley erupted in metallic chaos, every fragment of iron striking in a relentless chorus, the voice weaving through it like a chant. My lungs burned, legs heavy, but the thought of stopping was impossible. To stop meant to obey. Finally, by some miracle, we burst through a line of trees, stumbling onto the faint outline of a trail I recognized, the one leading back to camp. Relief surged, but it was poisoned, fragile. The clangs still echoed behind us, softer now but unrelenting, as if they followed at their own pace. When we reached camp, our tent was still there, our gear untouched, the little burner cold. But the air felt different, heavier. The woods weren't woods anymore. They were watchful. Aaron collapsed onto the ground, chest heaving, eyes wide as if expecting the voice to return. I knelt beside him, my own body trembling, listening for footsteps, for metal. Nothing came, only silence, thick and waiting. Neither of us slept. We sat there, staring into the dark, jumpy at every rustle, every shift of wind, and when dawn finally came, painting the ridge gold, we packed without speaking, without breakfast, without even looking at each other. The trail out of Max Patch felt longer than it had going in, and every bend felt like a chance for the clang to return. But it didn't. The woods stayed quiet, deceptively gentle, yet even now, years later, I hear it. Sometimes in dreams, sometimes in the quiet of my own house at night. That metallic clanging echoing through the valley of my memory, reminding me of the command we nearly obeyed. Stay. And I know, deep down, that if I ever return to Max Patch, the valley will remember me. When we finally left Max Patch behind us, stepping into the safety of the gravel parking lot where other hikers' cars stood waiting, I thought we had escaped. The clang was gone, the voice silenced, and the morning light washed the ridge in an innocent glow that made the night feel like a fever dream. But what I didn't understand then, and what I would learn in the months that followed, was that certain places don't release you just because you've stepped beyond their borders. Some places stay with you, nested in the corners of your mind, like rust beneath paint, eating through when you least expect it. Aaron didn't speak the entire drive home. His hands clutched the wheel with white knuckles, and every time we passed under a bridge or through a tunnel, he flinched like the clang might erupt from the concrete. I sat in silence too, staring out the window, trying to convince myself the sound had been nothing more than wind twisting through metal scraps left by hunters or locals. But each time I tried to rationalize, I heard it again in my memory. The deliberate rhythm, the echo that didn't belong to the air. That first night back in my apartment, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake listening to the faint hum of the city, headlights flickering across my walls, but my ears strained for something else. At 11:02, the exact time we'd heard it at Max Patch, a neighbor dropped something heavy upstairs. The thud was ordinary, explainable, but to me, it was the clang returning. My pulse raced, and I sat upright in bed, staring at the shadows, waiting for footsteps that never came. Aaron didn't answer my calls for days. When he finally did, his voice was hoarse, like someone who hadn't slept. "Don't talk about it," he said flatly. "Don't ever talk about it again." And then he hung up. But silence didn't help. The more I tried to push it away, the more it pressed back. I found myself replaying every detail, how the metal shivered in the still air, how the voice had spoken only one word, how Aaron had nearly obeyed, and I kept circling the same question. What would have happened if we had stayed? Weeks passed. My appetite dulled, my concentration slipped. At work, I stared at spreadsheets without reading them, hearing phantom clanging beneath the hum of the office. One afternoon, I walked past a construction site downtown. The workers struck steel beams with hammers, and I froze in the middle of the sidewalk, breath locked in my chest. Their sounds weren't the same, but my body reacted anyway. Sweat breaking, heart sprinting, legs shaking. People brushed past me, annoyed, but all I could think was that the valley had followed me here. The real breaking point came one night when I tried to hike again, close to home, just to prove I wasn't broken. The trail was gentle, nothing like the bald ridges of Max Patch. Yet when dusk settled and the woods grew quiet, I realized I was listening for it, half hoping not to hear it, half expecting to. And when a deer moved through the brush with a heavy step, I nearly screamed. I bolted back to my car without finishing the loop, chest heaving like I had run for miles. Aaron, meanwhile, disappeared into himself. His social media went dark, his phone straight to voicemail. Weeks later, when I drove out to his house, his blinds were drawn and his yard overgrown, mail piled up on the porch. I knocked until my knuckles hurt. He didn't answer. I don't know what he was hearing in that silence. I don't know if the clang reached him the same way it reached me, or if the voice still spoke to him in dreams. But something told me that while I was running from it, he was listening. Months blurred together, and I began to wonder if it had all been in my head, some shared hallucination born of fear and fatigue. But then came the night I woke to a sound in my apartment. Not a bang, not a clang, just a faint metallic ringing, so soft it could have been imagination. My clock read 11:02. I sat frozen in bed, every hair on my arm standing, waiting for it to fade. It didn't fade. It grew one strike after another, echoing through my small apartment with impossible depth, as though the walls themselves were hollow metal. I stood, shaking, searching the rooms with a baseball bat in my hand. Nothing was there. The sound had no source, yet it filled the space. And then, clear as the stars over Mac's patch, the voice came again. Stay. I dropped the bat. My knees buckled. The word rippled through me, a vibration in my chest, a pressure behind my eyes. This wasn't memory. This wasn't fear. This was the valley, here now, reminding me of the command I had defied. The sound stopped after a few minutes, leaving me gasping in silence. But the silence didn't comfort. It waited. It expected. The next day, I drove back to Mac's patch. I told myself it was to face it, to prove I wasn't captive to a sound. But part of me knew the truth. I wasn't going to fight it. I was going because I wanted to understand what it wanted. The trailhead looked the same, cheerful hikers coming and going, kids running ahead of their parents, laughter in the air. None of them knew. None of them heard it yet. I walked past them, past the grass that brushed my legs, up toward the bald ridge. The sun was lowering, painting the valley gold. My heart raced with each step. At the crest, I stopped. The ridge was bare. No metal hung from posts, no rusted fence cut through the hollow. Nothing marked what Aaron and I had seen. Yet I knew I hadn't imagined it. My bones remembered the clang too well. As the sky darkened, the laughter of hikers faded, their voices drifting away down the mountain. I stood alone. I checked my watch. 11. The wind stilled. My pulse thundered. 11:01. The grass bowed slightly, as though something heavy had brushed past. The clang rang out, clear, sharp, undeniable. And this time, I didn't run. I stood there, heart hammering, waiting for the voice. When it came, it was softer, almost coaxing. Stay. The word didn't strike like an order now. It sounded like a plea, like the valley itself was lonely, asking not to be abandoned. For one terrible moment, I wanted to obey, to sink down into the grass, close my eyes, and let the clang be the last sound I ever heard. But then I thought of Aaron, silent in his darkened house. I thought of what it meant to lose yourself to something that wasn't yours. And I forced myself to step back, to tear my gaze from the stars above, to remember the life I had beyond this ridge. My body trembled, sweat dripping cold down my back. I whispered into the dark, voice shaking, "No." The clang stopped, the valley hushed, and I left. But even now, telling this, I don't know if I escaped. Because every night at 11:02, whether in silence or in dream, I still listen. And sometimes if I listen hard enough, I swear I hear it again. Distant, waiting, calling, stay. The hardest part wasn't the clang itself. It was the silence that followed. Once you've heard a sound that has no source, once you've been given a command from a place that isn't supposed to speak, silence stops being a comfort. It becomes a waiting room. That was the weight I carried after Mac's patch, and it never left me. Every quiet house, every empty trail, every night where 11:02 ticked past on a clock, it all felt like the prelude to that metallic call. For weeks after that second visit, I avoided telling anyone. Not my family, not my coworkers, not even Aaron. Especially not Aaron. The last time I'd seen him, his eyes looked like glass, reflecting everything but containing nothing. His silence wasn't avoidance anymore. It was surrender. And I couldn't let myself follow him down that road, even if my ears strained for the clang each night like an addict waiting for a hit. What I didn't expect was how the valley crept into my waking life in ways I couldn't predict. Little things. The clatter of a dropped spoon echoing too long, the slam of a dumpster lid vibrating through the night air with uncanny resonance. The clang had attached itself to memory, yes, but worse, it had learned to wear disguises. I began to dread ordinary noises because behind each one, I half believed the valley was speaking again, checking to see if I'd changed my mind. One night, after weeks of living like this, I tried something different. Instead of running from the silence, I leaned into it. I turned off the TV, shut down every hum of appliance, drew the curtains tight, and sat in darkness. I thought if I faced it willingly, maybe the valley wouldn't need to sneak up on me. My heart pounded as the minutes crawled past. 10:59. The tick of the clock became deafening. At 11:02, nothing happened. No clang. No voice. Just silence. And that was somehow worse, because it told me the valley wasn't gone. It was choosing. It was waiting for me to weaken, to return, to listen with both ears instead of just one. Days later, I drove past the edge of town where the train tracks cut across the road. A freight train was crawling through, steel wheels grinding, cars clanking against each other. The sound hit me like a blow to the chest. I had to pull over, sweating, clutching the steering wheel, because each clash of metal sounded like that same command hidden inside it. Stay, stay, stay. I knew it wasn't the valley this time, but my body didn't care. My body reacted like the mountains had reached across miles to tug me back. It was then I realized I couldn't outwait this. I couldn't starve it by ignoring it. The valley wanted something, and until I understood what, it would follow me. So I went back a third time. This time, I didn't tell anyone. I parked at the trailhead near dusk, laced my boots, and carried only a small pack. No tent, no food, just a flashlight and a notebook. My plan wasn't survival, it was understanding. If the valley wanted me to stay, I needed to know why. The climb felt different that night. My legs moved slower, not from exhaustion, but from hesitation. Every bend in the trail whispered of memory. Every shadow felt like it hid a warning. When I reached the bald crest, the stars were already spilling across the sky, sharp and endless. I stood in the open air, notebook trembling in my hand, and waited. The clang came right on time, clear, resonant, like it had been expecting me. This time I didn't flinch. I didn't run. I sat cross-legged in the grass and wrote the word down. Clang. Then the voice came, softer again, curling into my bones like smoke. Stay. I wrote that too. And then I whispered back into the night, why? For a moment, nothing answered. The silence pressed against me, cold and heavy. Then, clang, 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 3 strikes, each one vibrating through the ridge. My pen shook, my breath hitched, and in the echoes of those strikes, I thought I heard something layered beneath. Not words exactly, but impressions. Images pressed into sound, chains, gates, doors, something locked away. It dawned on me then that maybe the valley wasn't asking me to stay for companionship. Maybe it wanted something else entirely. A witness. Or a guard. The thought chilled me deeper than any night wind, because if that was true, then leaving had never been an act of courage. It was abandonment. I had turned my back on something that didn't want freedom, but vigilance. And if I left again, who would take my place? I sat there shaking, torn in two. Part of me wanted to rise, to walk back down the trail, to leave this burden where I'd found it. But another part, the part that remembered the clang echoing through my apartment, the voice invading my silence, knew there was no leaving anymore. Whether I stood on the bald ridge or in my own bed miles away, the valley had already chosen me. The clang rang once more. The voice followed, not commanding now, but imploring, stay. And I broke. Not in fear, but in sorrow, because I understood. Staying meant giving up my life beyond this ridge. Staying meant surrendering to a vigil that would never end. But leaving meant carrying its echo forever, a weight that would hollow me until I resembled Aaron, silent, empty, already half gone. I whispered back, tears stinging my eyes. I can't. The valley groaned with sound. The clangs rose dozens at once, striking in furious discord like iron screaming. My bones rattled, my ears rang, and for a moment I thought the earth itself would split open beneath me. I threw my hands over my ears, curled forward, braced for collapse. And then silence. Not ordinary silence. Absolute silence. A silence so heavy it felt like standing at the bottom of the ocean, pressure closing in, breath stolen. The stars above me blurred, and for one impossible second, I thought I saw shapes moving between them, figures tall as mountains, draped in iron, faceless but watching. My chest ached, my pulse slowed, and just when I thought I might collapse into the grass and never rise again, the world returned. Wind rustled the ridge, crickets sang, the stars steadied, and the clang was gone, completely gone. I sat there trembling, waiting for it to return, but it didn't. Not that night, not the next, not even at 11:02. The voice never came back, not in my dreams, not in my silence. It had let me go. I walked down the mountain at dawn, legs weak, eyes hollow, notebook clutched to my chest like proof that it had all happened. The trailhead looked the same as always, but I was not. I had carried a burden up that ridge, and I left it there. Whatever the valley guarded, whatever the clang bound, it had chosen someone else now. Or maybe it had decided it needed no one at all. I don't know what became of Aaron. He never called again. I sometimes wonder if he answered in a way I refused to. Maybe he stayed. Maybe he's still there, somewhere in the silence, watching the iron sway. As for me, I learned something I never expected. Fear isn't always about what threatens to take your life. Sometimes fear is realizing what could demand it forever, not by killing you, but by keeping you. By asking you to sit in endless vigil until the world forgets you were ever more than a shadow on a ridge. And so now, when I hike, when I camp, when I stand in silence under the stars, I remember Max Patch. I remember that some sounds are not meant to be followed, some invitations not meant to be accepted. And when the woods fall quiet, when silence weighs heavy, I do the hardest thing I ever learned in those mountains. I take a breath, I steady my heart, and I walk away. Because the valley is still there. Because the clang will always echo in the bones of that ridge. And because I know with absolute certainty that if I stop to listen again, it will ask me to stay.